Hi everyone, welcome back to Feather Stitch House. My name's Rebecca and each week on this channel I make videos about embroidery and textile art to help you get creative. It's time for another stitch alphabet video. Last time we covered stitches beginning with F, so it's time for stitches beginning with G today. And there aren't that many of them, but the ones that there are really quite interesting stitches. They're great for texture, for fill and for decoration. So I'm going to be using my normal setup, my 6-inch embroidery hoop with natural linen, and I'm using a pearl cotton today. And I do recommend pearl cotton for learning stitches because you don't have to worry about the separation of the individual strands that you do when you're using stranded cotton. So if you have got a pearl cotton, it's really good. It's not the end of the world if you don't. All of them can be done really with any kind of thread. So just whatever you are comfortable with. So you will just need a needle, thread, pair of scissors and your embroidery hoop with fabric stretched drum tight. So gather all your bits and pieces and let's get stitching.
Hi there, welcome back to another Stitch Alphabet video. We are looking at the letter G today, so if you haven't come across this series before, I will link a playlist at the end of the video, so stay tuned for that. I'm going to show you a bunch of knots today beginning with G, and we're using these to create a fabric book that is a record of as many embroidery stitches as we can. So I've made pages that are basically a piece of natural linen on a piece of quilt batting, just an offcut of quilt batting, and I've done a bit of slow stitch, added some fabric and texture and a little felt letter, and I've just slow stitched using as many stitches beginning with each letter of the alphabet as possible. So we started with letter A. I'll just do a flip through and stop when we get to the letter that we're looking at today. So this was B and C, so loads of different stitches, and C I took inspiration from circles as well because they also begin with C, and then D was lots of detached stitches on this one. The colours have been mostly chosen by my Instagram followers, who I usually do a poll when I'm making a new page, and yeah, so my Instagram followers choose which colour I'm going to do. This was E, and we did some English paper piecing in the background. The last video I posted was the F stitches, so loads of really nice organic looking stitches on that page. That was the last one, and so today we are looking at the letter G, and this was my G page. This was the fabric that Instagram chose as my colour inspiration, and I just picked up the colours from that and used those in the stitching. So we've got some really nice stitches today, lots and lots of texture. There aren't a lot of stitches that begin with G, but the ones that there are really nice and versatile, and we can play around with them quite a lot. So I hope you are ready for action. So I'm going to stitch in my embroidery hoop again. I'm stitching on natural linen, and I'm going to be using some pearl cotton, size 12 pearl cotton, because it's really good for learning embroidery. You don't have separate strands to worry about, so you can stitch with it very simply. So I'm going to set up my hoop in my frame, and let's get going with some stitch learning. I'm going to start with a really straightforward one. It's called glove stitch, and this is a decorative edging stitch, but it can also be used for seams and edging. Works in a similar way to blanket stitch, but it's a much more straightforward stitch even than blanket stitch. So I'm coming up on the left hand side on my bottom line, and I'm going to make a vertical stitch straight up from where my thread came out, and that's my first stitch. Now I want to come back up at my starting point there, so I'm going to come back up at the point where my needle first came through, and because I've got a knot, I'm just checking on the back to make sure that knot is out of my way, like that. And this time we're going to make a diagonal stitch, so I'm just going to come up diagonally. So like blanket stitch, we're going to imagine there's a little square, and we want to go diagonally up to the top right of that square. So up to my top line diagonally and pull through, and then we're going to come up again directly below that top point, and we're just going to create that arrangement again. So vertically up, at the bottom of that stitch, and we're imagining our little square. We're going to go diagonally up to the top right corner of that square, and we're back through, down to the bottom line again directly below, and vertically up. So we're making these sort of asymmetric V shapes that just form a straight line. So really super simple, and can work as an edging, like I say, in a similar way to blanket stitch. It's a good one as well if you're joining two pieces of fabric with an overlap. So if you've got a seam that's overlapping, this one works really nicely. So super simple, 2 straight stitches arranged in an offset V. Just create a little tiny gap there. I am working at a peculiar angle, so please do forgive. When I'm recording these videos, obviously the camera is giving you what should be my perspective, so I'm working around the camera. The camera's where my face would normally be, so I have to work at a bit of an angle to get this, but it's fine. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing and see the effect of the stitch. It's better on straight edges, but you could probably curve this around a corner if you were careful. There we go. So that is glove stitch. Really simple, quite a funky looking stitch, and really good for seams and edges. Okay, another super simple one. I don't need a line for this one because this is a standalone stitch, and if you've been doing Winging It this year, we used this back in September on our Fields of Gold panel. This one's called a Granito, and it's a really lovely textural stitch that you can use. We used it to make seeds. The word Granito literally means grain or seed. So we're going to bring our needle up. It's another one made out of straight stitches, and I want to make a small straight stitch. I've got about a ½ centimetre long stitch there, straight down. Then we're going to come up again at our starting point, so we're always going to start in the same point, like that. We're going to make another vertical stitch, but I'm just going to steer my thread, so when that loop sits against the fabric, it's sitting to the left of my first stitch. Okay, so that's 2 straight stitches together. So up at my starting point, down at the bottom, and this time I want to steer that loop so that it sits to the right. So just get your nail in to make it steer over to the right. Up at the starting point again, and we want another stitch, and we're steering it over to the left. So rather than sitting on top of the previous stitch, we want it to sit to the side. And one last stitch, so up at the top, down at the bottom again, and this time I'm steering it over to the right so that it sits to the right. And what we end up with is a little raised stitch that looks like a piece of pearl barley. So let me just show you that again. So up at the top, you can make these very small, just with 3 stitches, or you can do them about this size. So it's really good if you want to create like a French knot effect, but a French knot is going to be too small. So make my straight stitch up at the start again and down at the bottom, and I'm steering my loop over to the left, up at the top, down at the bottom, and steering the loop over to the right, and then we do the same again. So yeah, a little bit like a French knot, but creates a much bigger dot. And so if you are stitching something maybe that needs eyes, or you want to create texture, this one is really nice, and it's lovely if you work lots of them in lots of different colours and scatter them around. Great for creating texture. So there we go, that's 3 there. That's Granitos, so give that a try. It's a lovely one to incorporate into your slow stitch, and yeah, see how you get on with that. So that's Granitos. Okay, our next stitch is called Greek stitch, and I've done myself some guidelines. I've put in some little markers to create some squares, and this is much bigger than you would normally do, but I wanted you to be able to see what I was doing. This is normally a canvas work stitch, but you could easily play around with this and incorporate it into your slow stitch or your embroidery projects. So okay, so I'm going to come up bottom left of my first square, like that, and then I'm going to go up to the top right and come down on that corner. So we've made our first diagonal stitch, and this stitch is a variation on a cross stitch. So we're going to hop back to the top left of that first square, and we're going to go down bottom right, but not 1 square across. We're going to go 2 squares across and go down there. So we've got an offset cross stitch. So now we're going to go back to the bottom left of our second square, so halfway between those 2 points at the bottom, and we're going to go diagonally up 1 square, like that. And I'm going to go back to the top left of that square, and I'm going to go down diagonally to the bottom right, but I'm going to make that 2 squares long. So back 1 square, diagonally up 1 square, back 1 square, and diagonally down 2 squares, and we basically just keep going like that. So you can see it's making a really pretty crisscross. It's a little bit like herringbone stitch, we'll do that next time, but it's sort of tilted, offset. So this would be a really nice filling stitch if you wanted to fill a space. You could work this much smaller, make much tinier stitches, and the more accurately you make your grid, your squares, the more even and pretty it's going to be. So I've almost run out of thread. Let's see how far I can get. I'm not going to get all the way to the end. It's quite a thread hungry stitch this, because obviously you're making fairly long stitches along the back as well as on the front, but I think that's as far as I'm going to get with the thread that I've got. Maybe I can just put in one upward cross just to make it a little bit more even. So that is Greek stitch, and if you wanted to use it as a fill, you would repeat the process exactly underneath, and you could either offset them or you could match them up, and then you're going to get loads of these little diamonds that sit next to each other. You're going to have the same effect all the way down your fill. So that is Greek stitch. Right, I've drawn a little square on here so that you can see the next stitch. You can do this in pretty much any shape, so I've done it in a circle, rectangle, you could do square, pretty much any shape this works in. It's a fill stitch, so that's what I'm going to show you. Okay, so we're going to start by coming up in the top left hand corner. This is called Gobelin fill stitch or Gobelin filling, and it's a little bit like satin stitch but creates a much more textured fill and looks a little bit like it's woven, but it isn't. So top left, and we're going to make a stitch that's maybe 1/2 centimetre long, so a little bit like the length of our Granitos. So just like satin stitch, I want to come back up right next to that stitch, starting on the same line, but this time I only want to go halfway down it. So really tiny straight stitch, half the length of that first one. So up again on the top line, and we're going to come down and make a stitch that matches our first one, and then we're going to make a teeny tiny stitch next to it. So this is just the starting point. It's a little bit like long and short stitch, but this is going to give a much more regular fill. So long and short stitch, you don't have to keep all your stitches the same length, but this one looks much better if you do. So again, this one is more commonly worked on canvas, where you've got little holes that are evenly spaced to help you guide your stitches. But I just want to show you that you can do this on regular fabric as well. You don't have to do it on canvas or Aida or even weave or anything like that. So we're just going to work right the way along that top line. You want to keep your stitches as vertical and as straight at the top as you possibly can. So there are weave lines in this linen fabric that I can use to sort of guide me a little bit. And it's really important that you take your time and get this first line right, because it's going to steer everything else. You can create a gradient with this as well. So if I wanted to, I could change my thread now to a slightly lighter shade of red and stitch my next line, but I'm just going to do it all one colour just to show you the stitch. So I'm all the way across now, and I've got the top of my square filled in. So now I'm going to come down another stitch length on the right hand side. I'm going to work my way back, and I'm going to create some stitches that interlock. So we've done long and short stitches across the top to create that sort of up and down effect, but all our stitches are going to be the same length now, they're just going to be offset. So I've put my first stitch in on that right hand side, and then I want to come up at the bottom of that tiny stitch that's the next one along, and I'm going to go back down halfway along that first stitch on my second row. So you can use the bottom of your first line of stitches as a good starting point, and you want this next row of stitches to all line up again. So I'm finding the bottom of the previous stitch and making a straight stitch down. So these stitches sit together a bit like brickwork. And hopefully it won't be too long before you start seeing the effect that gets created. And the last one. Down on the left. So now we work back in the opposite direction again. So I'm coming down another stitch length, which should leave me a half stitch length at the bottom, and that's going to be where a small stitch goes. So up to the previous stitch, and then go into the gap, find the bottom of the last stitch, and make another vertical stitch that lands halfway down my first stitch on that row. So it's simple. The trick really is to keep your stitches even and get spacing right. That's where the challenge comes in this stitch. When it comes to making the stitches, not helpful. Okay, so I think we're probably on our last row now, and we just work back from right to left, filling in all the gaps. This time we're starting with the short stitches. So starting with a half stitch, then a full stitch, and we work our way back, filling all those gaps that are remaining. So there we go, that is Gobelin fill. It's not the neatest one I've ever done, but hopefully you get the idea. So we've got something that looks kind of basket weavy, but there's no weaving involved. It's just a first and last line of long and short stitch, and then even lengths of stitches filling in all the gaps in between. Keep going with it even if you think it's looking ropey. Always looks best when this shape is completed. So that is Gobelin fill stitch. Okay, our next stitch is one that you've probably come across before, but you might know it by a different name. So this is called the Ghiordes Knot, more often called turkey stitch, and it's used for filling, but you can use it on its own as well. So this one's quite unusual because we don't secure our thread, the stitch secures itself. So I've got no knot in the end of my thread, and I'm going to start by going down from the front through to the back of my fabric, and I want to leave a tail. So my tail there is about just over 1 inch long, something like that, a few centimetres. So now I'm going to go a tiny distance over to the left on the back, in line with where I went down through the fabric, and I'm going to come up, hold that tail in place. I'm going to hop over about the same distance over to the right, like that, and before I've pulled through, I'm going to come up at that same point that I went down, like that, and pull through, and that creates a little anchoring stitch, a holding stitch that sits over the point where that stitch began. So I could just cut that off now, but you can join these together and make lots of stitches that sit together that are looped. Alright, so I'm just going to leave that as a loop. I'm going to hop across half a stitch length. So if I think about this as the length of a stitch, I want to go half of that over to the right and go down, and want to leave a tail. I want to leave a loop that is as long as the tail that I left. So I've got my loop there, look, that's my first starting tail. Now I've got a loop. So now I'm going to, on the back, come across to the left and up where that first stitch was. Hold my tail while I pull through so that I don't pull the tail through. Hop across to the right hand side of that starting point, and before I've pulled all the way through, I want to go back up at my starting point. So now I want to pull through, I've got another little holding stitch. So again, I want to hop across to the right, pull through leaving a loop, over to the left and pull through, hold the loop so you don't pull all that thread through, over to the right of that starting point, and before I've pulled all the way through, I want to come back up at my starting point, and this time I can pull it tight. So I've got 3 little stitches there working horizontally, and I'm just going to do one more. So I'm going to hop across, leave a loop, over to the left and pull through, holding onto my loop, hop across to the right of that starting point, and before I pull through, I'm going to come back up at the starting point and pull all the way through. So now I'm at the end of that row. I can take my scissors and snip off that knot. So you can create quite a nice effect just like that, but I'm going to do a couple more layers and show you how to create a fill using this. So we're going to come down a tiny distance, so like a millimetre or two, and we're going to make another row, but this time our loops are going to sit in between that first line of stitches, so our loops are going to be all offset. So here's where the loop is sitting on my first row, so I want my loop to be here, so that's where I'm going to go down first of all. So I'm just going a couple of millimeters down on the fabric, taking my thread down at that point, and then I want to hop to the left, and I should be coming up directly below the loop on that first line of stitches. So pull through so that your loop is the same length as the previous row. Hop over to the right, so now I should be directly under my second loop on the first row of stitches, and before I've pulled all the way through, I want to come up in the middle and pull through. So that's my first stitch in my second row. So repeat the process again. I want to go a stitch length along, keep my loop steady, hop up to the left, holding onto my loop, hop over to the right, so now I'm directly under the third loop, and before I've pulled all the way through, I'm going to come up at that central point. And we just carry on like that. So I'm going to pull through, up to the left, hold the loop, down to the right, up at my starting point again, and pull through. And I'm going to trim that off. So you can make as many rows of this as you like. My next row would be a couple of millimeters down again, lined up with the first row of stitches, and my fourth row would be lined up with this row. And when you're done, when you've put in as many as you like, you can either leave them loopy like that, or you can take your scissors and cut each of those loops. So just put your scissors in, lift up until it's taut, and then snip, and that gives you some tufting. And if you want to, then you can trim them all, so you can leave it ragged if you want to, but you can trim them all to the same length, and once you've got loads of those together, it creates a really sort of tufty and fluffy effect. So if I bring in an example from my page, this is the Ghiordes Knot. So I've left those quite long. These I've spaced more widely so it looks a bit more ragged, but this just looks like fluffy fabric. And the name Turkey stitch, it's not anything to do with turkeys really, it's Turkish stitch, and it's the stitch used in making Turkish rugs. So that's the effect that you can create if you block them really closely together. So that's the Ghiordes Knot. Right, our last one we're not going to do on our fabric because it's in a hoop. I've got a little bit of ribbon here, and I'm just going to show you gathering. So this is a really simple one, and we're going to do it on a piece of ribbon, and then we can attach the ribbon to our fabric. So I'm going to work right to left just because it's going to be easier to film. I'm just going to come up through my backing fabric, and I want to go through my ribbon. I'm going to go in the middle of my ribbon here, and what I'm going to do is make a running stitch along the centre of that ribbon. You want to keep it fairly even, and you can do it by rocking the fabric onto your needle. And I'm just loading up the needle, and then I can pull through. Put too many stitches on. So just pull through, and then I'm just going to work my way to the end. So it's a simple running stitch, but we're working free of our backing fabric. So just work your way along, load up a few stitches, and then pull through. Like that. Back down through the ribbon, and so what I'm going to do now is keep pulling. So I'm just going to slide that fabric along the thread and keep pulling, and then once I've got as much thread through as I can then go back down through my base fabric and pull tight, and now I've got a ruched little bit of fabric. So I've done it in a red thread so you can see it. Got my running stitches there, but if I just keep pulling, that will gather up and create a little, almost like a pom-pom. And obviously you can gather it more or less, you can have just a ripple, but here I've got it really nice and tight onto my backing fabric. I've pulled as much thread through as I possibly can, and then I would secure it on the back. So that is gathering, really super simple textile art technique made with a very simple embroidery stitch. So that is all our G stitches. There aren't very many, but if you do know any more, let me know in the comments, because I'd love to learn a few more. So we've got glove stitch, Granitos, Greek stitch, Gobelin fill stitch, Ghiordes Knot, and gathering, and that's it for G stitches. So would love to see what you do with these stitches, and if you're making the fabric book, you can post at #FeatherStitchHouse A to Z, and that way all our A to Z book panels will be gathered together in one place. There's plenty to play with here, and I hope that's captured your imagination. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit that like button if you've enjoyed this content, and I will see you very soon for another video. Take care, have fun stitching. Bye.